It's great to be here. As a botanist and plant pathologist, I feel in good company. Perhaps I should just explain what my role is. So I essentially lead the government response to plant health, tree health. I also look after bee health. And that means we assess risks and try and understand what the mitigations might be to future plant and tree health risks. We advise ministers, talk to stakeholders and come up with solutions. And then that means we can change policy. So essentially, that's my role in government. But we work with your community. You know, we work with the science base, practitioners, people that look after plants and trees, in order to understand what the threats are, what the risks are, and what we all need to do. And the threats are growing. You can see the kind of upward trajectory here over the last 100 years or so of the number of plant pests that have been established in the UK. And this is driven by globalization in trade, movement of people, movement of plants. And it's really unprecedented, the volumes of plants and trees that we're moving around. And in terms of figures, we are massively a net importer of plants and plant products. We export some, but the bulk is that we're bringing things into the country. So obviously that represents risks. And particularly things like this, mature trees. These are olive trees which have their own particular risk profile. They're mature trees, they're loaded onto a lorry, they're transported, and they can be here in a couple of days. So we have a challenge in that this species is currently regulated, it is passported. My inspectors will inspect it and try and sort of check that it's free of pests and diseases, but look at it, it's huge, it's got soil, and it's becoming increasingly difficult to actually inspect material like this. And particularly olive is a high risk. I'll talk about that a little bit later. Wood and wood products are very risky. So typically you imagine the kind of sawn wood, the timber, but we get all sorts of wood. We get pallets, we get wood packaging, we get firewood, we get random bits of wood used for all sorts of purposes. So that's been a challenge to get on top of that. And we know that in other parts of the world, pests have definitely been moved in firewood because of the practice of taking your firewood in your camper van and taking it somewhere else into a pristine forest. So we have very strict regulations on wood and firewood, but it's something that we're constantly having to be vigilant about. And then, of course, direct sales and the internet are a whole new world of risk. And we are getting to grips with this. We work with the online sales, we search for keywords. Where we find prohibited material, we get the online auction to take it down. But inevitably people think that just because they can get something on the internet, that must be okay and it's legal. So we're doing a lot of work with the parcel depots, with the postal depots to try and assess what the risk is. And these are just a couple of examples where somebody's smuggling potatoes, which are prohibited, and curry leaves, which are also currently prohibited from many parts of the world. So, you know, a combination of online intelligence, people on the ground, sometimes using dogs that will sniff out the material to try and get to grips with this. But it's definitely with us. And there are some very good internet businesses. So, you know, we need to understand how to better regulate them so that we can manage risk, but they can also trade in this new way. And then you get unexpected sources of risk. This was a headboard that somebody had complained had a sort of noise in it. They were trying to, this family, they were trying to get to sleep. They could hear this scratching in the night. They thought the house was haunted. Didn't really know what to do. They got hold of the council, the pest inspector, and anyway, somehow a plant health inspector got involved, and we know exactly what the problem is. The problem is Asian longhorn beetles that lay their eggs in the wood, and that is the larvae. It's about up to 4 or 5 centimetres long, and it essentially sits there happily munching its way through your headboard, and then one day it will pupate and it will emerge through a hole And then that's the giveaway when you see the hole and this spectacular Asian longhorn beetle pop out. We're getting more and more of this, and this is a reputable manufacturer, supposedly, of furniture. But where's the wood coming from? Bits of wood, cheaply put together, cover it in some fabric no one can see. So we've had a few interceptions like this, and again, it's trying to improve standards in industry. And then, sometimes these sort of get into the media, people get very worried. And the problem is when we get hold of your sofa, I'm afraid it gets destroyed because of the risk of beetles. So as you can gather, there is risk everywhere. My job's quite stressful because I see risk everywhere. And there's a whole load of other risks around works of art and football pitches, which I haven't really got time to go into today. But we need a way of assessing risk and managing it. So the way we've done that, we've developed the UK Plant Health Risk Register. So this is unique. No one else has this. We started it in 2013. And it was really in the wake of Ash dieback where we felt like we weren't ready for that. We didn't know that was going to happen. So let's try and be more proactive about assessing risk. We don't want any surprises. So we have a team of pest risk analysts that work to me, and essentially they scour the world for new and emerging threats, working with scientists, working with practitioners, and we give everything a risk rating based on how likely is it to get here in terms of the pathway. What would happen if it did get here? Could it establish? Could it complete its life cycle? Is it going to spread? How many years would it take to complete its life cycle, etc.? And thirdly, what impact would it have? Is it going to have a severe economic impact on crops, on trees, and so on? So we give everything a risk rating. The top risk rating is 125, and then we can actively manage that portfolio of risks. Unfortunately, there are more than 1,000, so it's a large number of risks. But many of them are low risk. So we've probably got about 60 in the highest risk category. And this just shows, since we launched the risk register, the number of threats, it's actually slowing down. So that shows that we're really sort of on top of at least knowing what's out there. Of course, there are always new things, new reports of, particularly amongst trees, declines and sort of unknown syndromes that we want to investigate. So we actively manage these risks. We report them to ministers. We have a monthly biosecurity meeting with ministers. We'll flag up anything new and emerging and then make a decision about what are we going to do. Are we going to regulate it? Is it more for public awareness? Can industry manage it alone? Are there pest control products, etc., etc.? So it's very much an active management process. And the reason why this is so important is the value at risk is actually huge. So we've done some estimates of the value at risk, round about 9 billion total from forestry and sort of healthy crops. And that's made up of the value from crops and horticulture, also commercial forestry, and then the social and environmental value, more difficult to monetize. And of course, for this audience, that's what it's all about really. How do we understand better the wider societal risks and benefits? Of course, plants in food and drink are worth about 20 billion, and we've estimated the environmental benefits around about 20 billion. And actually the asset value of our trees and woods is a very big number indeed, 175 billion. So economists, statisticians develop these figures, and again, they're working with the research base. It's really important that we understand and value what's at risk, because then we can go and make the case for funding, for research, for action, to mobilize the community to do something. So, it's important that obviously these figures are meaningful, but that we constantly review them. But the whole area of the wider impacts on people and the planet is actually a very interesting area. And the evidence base is not that strong at the moment. It's an emerging evidence base. And I just wanted to share with you some of our thoughts about where we feel the important elements are. And as a research community, I'm hoping that some of you are already doing some of this, or you might be inspired to think, yeah, actually those are really important areas for us to work on. So obviously we all love trees, that's why we're here. But what do other people think about trees and plants? You know, we've got very strong emotional connections to wildlife. People love to protect wildlife and animals, but I think they often take trees for granted and plants. You know, we've been trained to look at them. You know, I'm a plant pathologist. You can't take me anywhere without me looking up, looking down, looking for what are the problems here. And so we notice trees and plants, but a lot of people don't. So what are the societal values? So it's just it's quite a long list here, but just to give you a flavour of the kind of things that we've been looking at. So a whole range of health and well-being factors, the nature and landscape, education and learning, of course the economy, and how we develop socially through plants. And of course there's also very strong cultural and symbolic value to plants and trees. And it does vary from country to country. Lots of interesting work going on in New Zealand around cultural and symbolic significance of certain plants and trees. So then we look at all the types of benefit, and you know, it's a huge list. And actually all of these things are what makes us a society, a community. Plants and trees are absolutely at the heart of that, and yet people sort of don't always notice them or value them. So when we look at in a little bit more detail about that, so physical health, you know, many of you probably go for walks in woods, runs in the woods, but you know, how do we actually demonstrate the real benefit of that? You know, physical activity is much easier when you're in the natural environment. You know, it's more interesting, you've got something to look at, and by encouraging people to use the natural environment can have a massive impact on disease and death, and it encourages people to get out there. We've estimated more than 2 billion annual savings if we could get people into the natural environment in terms of averting public health costs. So that's very, very significant. But it's probably a massive underestimate, and again needs much more sort of detailed analysis. And social prescription is something that, it's not new. I met a doctor recently, a GP. He's been doing social prescription for 20 years. But of course, we're only beginning to really realise the value of it now. And he presented some really compelling evidence, because in today's society there are real issues about people's relationship with the environment, their purpose, and that's where the natural environment can help. It actually causes stress, cancers, inflammations if people are suffering from anxiety and stress. And this is exacerbated by not being able to go into the wider environment, not being able to go for walks and in parks. So, you know, the evidence base is very, very strong. So social prescribing is a really important enabling tool for the health sector. But I suspect it's going to take quite a while for it to become, you know, more accepted and more mainstream. And community activities as well that come from that are very important. So, you know, we need a stronger evidence base here so that people don't think, oh, I'm just being fobbed off, you know, what I really want is antibiotics, and I'm now being told to go for a walk in the woods, and that feels like a cop-out, but actually the benefits should be much greater, as well as, of course, we've got an issue with antimicrobial resistance that we need to handle. So I find this area really important and interesting. And of course, in the urban environment, trees have a critical role in urban cooling. High temperatures that we've been having over the last few years, you know, climate change, extremes of temperature, we get a massive benefit from trees, their cooling effect, their shading effect, and so on. And so that we see in the urban environment where trees are being lost, it really does have huge health benefits, health impacts. So again, you know, valuing our urban trees, planting more urban trees is very, very important. And some trees actually remove pollutants from the air. We've got sort of WHO estimates that air pollution is having a massive impact, and some species of trees can have real benefits. The plane tree, for example, the London plane, which is very common, it actually absorbs particulates into its bark, and then it can shed its bark. And then that can be gathered up, and you're actually removing pollutants from the air, so it can have quite a big impact. And then mental health and well-being, again, another area which is incredibly important. I mean, we're at Kew today. I mean, you know as good as I do, you have a walk around Kew Gardens, you feel really good. You know, it's a fantastic place, it's inspiring, it makes you feel, much better about the world. It does me anyway. I've been coming here since I was about 3, so I feel it's had a lifelong impact on my health and well-being. So of course, stress relief, particularly in urban areas, if you've got access to nice parks and gardens, it can be incredibly important. But actually that's where it's really important that the public feel welcome somewhere like Kew. And I know many of you work in botanic gardens globally. How do we encourage everybody into the gardens? How do we be inclusive, make sure that parts of society don't feel that this isn't somewhere where they can come? And it's great to see, families, children coming and just experiencing the natural environment. So, we've again got very strong evidence about mental well-being and also lower rates of criminal behaviour where people have access to open spaces. So that's the case, and a lot of you are nodding, so you all know that this makes sense. So I'll just share with you now a few sort of case studies of plant health impacts where that really threatens everything I've just talked about. And the first one I'm sure you'll be aware of is the ash dieback situation. So these were the headlines about 6-7 years ago when suddenly we were very surprised that ash dieback was in the UK and it was already having an impact on ash trees. And this was an interesting time. There was massive public interest, media interest, you might call it social amplification. What could happen? Worst case scenario, we're going to lose all our ash trees. That was actually an important moment in people realising that A, they knew what ash was and they might be able to recognise it, and B, they actually cared about it. And this has been a very difficult problem to manage. Ash dieback is established. We actually now know that it's been here since the early 2000s, probably around about 2003, 2004. By looking at the cores of trees that have been recently felled, you can actually see the staining going back a long way. So it was here much longer. Why didn't we notice it? It's part of the issue that we don't really manage woodlands that actively. And when something's happening with our trees, we don't notice it until it's rather too late. So ash dieback has had a major impact. Partly it was exacerbated by importing trees, ash trees, but actually we now know that it also arrived by wind-blown spores across the channel. So we've had this sort of massive insurgence of spores around Suffolk, Norfolk and Kent, which is where the highest impacts have been felt. And we have a lot of ash trees in the landscape. Many were planted historically, or you'll see them by roadsides as amenity trees. And we know that there will be severe economic impacts of ash dieback. There was a paper published earlier this year which estimated that the cost might be as much as 15 billion over 100 years. And that's combining losing the biodiversity benefits of ash. Ash supports nearly 1,000 species and about 45 are obligate. So that sort of accounting, also looking at the cost of removal of ash from the environment where they're causing problems. And when they become a health and safety hazard by a road or a railway, they need to be felled. So we've been working with industry and other departments to produce an ash dieback toolkit to help advise landowners how to assess the state of their ash, when to make a decision about does it need to be felled. We also conducted the largest experiment of ash screening in the world. We screened 155,000 ash seedlings from 15 provenances over 14 sites in the UK to see if we could find any resistance. And we did, so that's been really positive. These are actually the trees that survived, so they're looking pretty healthy. We've collected them, and the Future Trees Trust are looking after them, and they're going to become part of a living ash project. They will be introduced into a breeding programme. And the other good thing from this work is that the ash genome was sequenced for the first time. And Richard Buggs here at Kew, he was part of that project. And that's really significant. You know, how come nobody had ever bothered to sequence one of the most important native species before? We're now working on the oak genome and discovering, you know, incredible things about our native oaks. So that's a positive. So the hope factor is we will have ash in the landscape. Tolerant trees will set seed, they'll regenerate, as well as we have a breeding programme now to reintroduce them. The elm's also being reintroduced now through a whole range of resistant cultivars. And then moving on to the next sort of threat to ash, which is the emerald ash borer. And this is a very, very high risk. This is one of our highest risks. It's native to Asia, but it's been in North America for quite some time, and it's had massive impacts. It's literally wiped out billions of ash trees, had a really big impact in urban environments where ash trees are planted, near housing. You know, they've just been completely lost. And it's getting closer. It's been in Russia for a few years. We now believe it to be in the Ukraine, and this is a killer. Ash dieback can have a long-term impact on trees, doesn't always kill them that quickly. This can kill very quickly. So the main pathway is wood, actually, rather than trees. We've still got a ban on ash trees, but wood can bring it in. And in terms of human health, there's a very, very clear demonstration now that where ash dieback has become established in North America, it's having massive air quality and human health benefits. So again, an emerging evidence base. And you know, people are very rapidly planting replacements. So you know, looking at what are the options for replacing ash trees. Moving on to the olive now, and this is an olive grove in the Puglia region of Italy. And every single one of those trees is dead because of Xylella fastidiosa, a bacterial plant pathogen. So this is a very, very high priority. It's spread by the spittlebug, which is a native species. We've got it everywhere here. So we've got the vector, we've got the host. It's got a very wide host range. It's not just olive, there are about 500 susceptible hosts. And there have been multiple findings in Europe. So this is very much on our radar to keep it out of the UK. These are all the findings in Europe. It's pretty much established in all these places, having an impact on almond groves in Alicante, olives in Puglia, and kind of Mediterranean plants here. So we've been regulating this one, you know, very, very rigorously. Moving on to food security. I mean, I've talked about trees a lot, that's very important to us, but what about food? The fall armyworm, which is a Spodoptera species, it is literally marching across the world. This is the moth, and the caterpillars cause massive amounts of damage, typically in things like maize, but actually it's got a very wide host range. So it is native to the tropical Americas, but we suspect it might have arrived in Africa from aircraft. It might have actually been in the fuselage of aircrafts. And in many African countries, there is a food security state of emergency because of this pest. So it's now moving across Africa. It's been reported in Asia. We've got controls on it. We inspect for it. We occasionally intercept it. So very much, you know, for the UK, it wouldn't be such an issue. You know, we would probably be able to manage it. But in areas of the world dependent on things like maize, sorghum, it's having a massive impact. So that shows the food security elements. So what can you do? Well, some of you may have flown here. I don't know if anyone saw our Don't Risk It light boxes at the airports. We've had them this summer. And essentially, this is our nudge strategy to say to the public, don't bring back any plant material, potatoes, cuttings, etc., because of the risks. Obviously, many of you do go collecting plants in the wild, but of course you do that in a very responsible way, and it's all permitted and quarantined. But most people just don't think, oh gosh, that cutting that I got when I went to Puglia, or that little olive tree I brought back, that could be the start of introducing Xylella into the UK. So, we really want the public to become more aware about this. We've also got lots of citizen science projects. This one, Observatory, is a tree reporting system. So we train 200 expert volunteers to identify these 25 tree pests. And then working with a range of partners, the Woodland Trust, Forest Research, they report it through an online tool. And this is absolutely fantastic, because when there's an outbreak, I am responsible. And these people are actively looking for these problems. And these lovely ladies, they actually found our second finding of oriental chestnut gall wasp. So Amanda is the volunteer, and actually her daughter went with her, and they found the second finding. So that was really, really important at the time, because then it's not just one outbreak, you've got more than one. And this is our tree alert reporting tool. Any of you can use this, can upload a photo of a sick-looking tree, and actually we encourage people to show us their nice-looking ash trees and elm trees, because that's just as important. And then we've got a process behind it to do a triage, and then we can come and see what's happening. We're also working with industry on biosecurity, and we have launched a biosecurity standard, and we're hoping to get that into a plant healthy standard that will go on plants in the garden centre, so that you will then know those plants are biosecure. They've either been UK sourced and grown, or they've been properly imported and inspected. So I think that's an important step forward. We also like to have public awareness, and this year we were at Chelsea with the Resilience Garden. So this is a kind of lineup of some of us on the first day. This is our garden. We used exotic trees as a way of demonstrating that, yes, we love native trees and we're protecting them, but we've got to look at a wider palette of trees, particularly because of climate change and because of biosecurity. So that really got the conversation going. We won a gold medal, which was great, but we got a lot of media interest, again, to get that conversation going. And next year is International Year of Plant Health, so that's very exciting. This has been designated by the United Nations, so it's quite a big deal. We'll be having a range of national events, science events, public events. We'll have National Plant Health Week in April next year. I think we're planning a conference here at Kew, and it's an opportunity for us to raise awareness amongst the public, the research communities, politicians, and so on. So if you want to know more, you can follow me on Twitter. I tweet about plant health, bee health, etc. But thank you very much for your attention.